Okay, so whether you hate or love Apple, you've gotta agree with me. They made a bigger impact than just contributing to the economy of the United States. I mean, take a look at the smartphone market before and after iPhone launched. Many of us, the iPhone users, just enjoy our favorite apps. We take this technology for granted, and I'm not saying that's a problem, but have you ever wondered what runs and supports these applications that you love? You see, when Jobs introduced the iPhone, we only got to know that the so called iPhone OS was heavily inspired from macOS and Unix. That is the founder of Unix, by the way. That photo. You'll get to know why I mentioned so called in the latter part of this video. But I think to most people like me, who aren't software engineers but are curious to understand about everything that is happening around us, he doesn't explain much about how this hugely popular OS runs under the hood. And yes, we're talking about iOS today. In this very first episode of How They Build series, we'll be learning about the technical and the non technical sides of the second most popular mobile operating system in the world, iOS. So, before diving into iOS specifically, it is very important to understand how the hugely popular personal computer Macintosh came into existence, because every other operating system that Apple went on to build leveraged heavily upon the solid foundation. In fact, even Android and all Apple's operating systems share a lot of similarities in their software architectures. A long time ago, computers weren't meant for ordinary people like us to use. It was huge, complicated, and ugly. Note I didn't mention expensive. Jobs, with his unique design thinking and communication skills, pitched Macintosh as a bicycle for the mind, which essentially meant it is an easy to use creative tool. It makes sense now, but most consumers don't buy technology on the basis of amount of RAM or how fast its processor can execute instructions. Most people are satisfied if it just works, fits their culture, and gets their job done. In order to do that, a software had to be designed from the ground up, something that employed graphical user interface for input. This is also worthy to remember because Apple did this one thing time after time really well, and that is to produce stuff with great aesthetics and user experience. And this was one thing that the competitors didn't perceive as an important thing to pay attention to. And man, who doesn't know that Apple did invent this thing in the first place? In this case, it was Xerox Corporation, but you can see them practicing this philosophy even to this day. It was Apple who communicated and commercialized this concept really well. Once the market was mature enough and educated enough, but not so goofy or futuristic, they launched their products. These people are calculated risk takers, as you see. Fun fact, even though we saw iPhone being launched first, iPad was already in development before iPhone was even realized. It was this dude, Scott Forstall in the middle, who sparked the conversation with Steve Jobs for a new smartphone. iPhone OS was obviously meant for iPhones only, but you see, by calling it iOS, you can end up wondering or speculating if there's even going to be another iDevice too. They just didn't want you to think so much, you see. Jobs wasn't another technician, a salesman, which most people consider him to be, or an artist like Picasso. He was a hybrid of all these personalities, making him look very believable and not shitty to people around him when he speaks. I don't want to go too deep into this, but I personally believe that he had learned the first principles of everything happening around him that matters, which is to have a very high level or basic understanding of various concepts. This is not a very new trait amongst the leaders even today. Many believe in making the most amount of impact in as many areas as possible in the shortest amount of time. Many Apple's products, including iPhone, iPad, and iPod, are assembled and manufactured along with Sony's PlayStation, Microsoft's Xbox, Nintendo's Wii or 3DS at Foxconn, or otherwise known as Honhai Precision Industry in Shenzhen, China, for obvious reasons labor cost and working hours are just to name a few. As a matter of fact, you two can fly to Shenzhen, strike a deal with a contractor or a company, and build your own smartphone brand for a very cheap price. Hey, I understand that it is not as simple as I'm making it sound, though. Let's dive into the technical side now. Just because Apple iOS is based on Unix, it doesn't mean they just took the source code of Unix like any other traditional open source code and started writing a bunch of random code on top of it. It was generations of employees and 30 years of hard work and experience that got them to where they're now. All operating systems of Apple share a very similar software architecture. It goes in this order. The first is Darwin OS, which is the open source kernel. Then the core services, which contains the APIs and services for communicating with the kernel. And then the media and graphics layer, which is responsible for graphics and multimedia rendering in your system. And lastly, the Cocoa Touch layer, which includes the front end or framework that all your favorite applications are developed with. Darwin OS is pretty much the heart of iOS. It is the open source kernel developed by Apple. It performs all the low level operations such as job scheduling, resource management, file system, and lots of others. Every kernel is tailored to run on a specific hardware architecture and is expected to constantly evolve with time. You too can contribute code or use it in your own projects and save time. There are primarily two types of kernels. One is the monolithic kernel, which incorporates the entire kernel in one space, and microkernel, which is layered and performs a basic or specific set of operations in each unit. Darwin OS, on the other hand, takes inspiration from both of these kernels. It combines the modularity of microkernel and flexibility of monolithic kernel, and we call it the hybrid kernel. There are a large number of kernels available, some made for servers and desktops, some for mobile, some for fun. Linux, for instance, is a Unix clone that was born out of a desire to serve as a free alternative to commercial Unix environment. You too can use these kernels for your hardware project if you're building one and save time on recoding these complex modules. Darwin OS was initially developed for DeX Computers, the company that Steve Jobs founded after being fired from Apple. This company was later acquired by Apple, and Jobs also returned with his experience. Every layer is proprietary from now on. Core OS or core services provide low-level services from the kernel for your favorite apps through this interface. High-level permissions for your applications like iCloud Access, WebKit, GCD, Maps, Address Book, SQLite database, core data, and many more are provided by this layer. I understand that it sounds like a Greek and Latin, but bear with me, you'll understand even more clearly when we start exploring the model view controller in the latter part of the same video. To understand how core services are employed in apps, I would request you to consult an app developer or explore how permissions are granted for your apps. As the name describes, this layer is responsible for providing the APIs for rendering graphical content on your devices, be it video, audio, game, or almost anything GUI. These thoroughly documented and written APIs makes the developer's job easy because they don't need to have low-level interactions with the OS for things such as GPU optimizations, drawing primitive shapes, Unicode text, shaders, etc. Game engines and media editors, for instance, do these heavy lifting for us. The content producers. Lastly, the Cocoa Touch as in iOS is the framework provided by Apple for the developers to build their apps upon. These contain the UI toolkit or widgets and frameworks so developers can build apps based on the design and development conventions defined by Apple. Apps are developed using Apple's IDE called Xcode, which follows the model view controller architecture. Model view architecture. Let me go ahead and explain each of these layers in detail. So, model view controller defines the behaviors, permissions, and patterns of the apps. For example, in a chat application, the instantiation and authorization of the database where the chat data is stored, the permissions that the app requires from the OS, third-party libraries, and lots of other things. View in model view controller is basically the front end output or GUI that the end user interacts with, like the buttons, switches, lists, etc. Every UI element has a defined set of permissions, features, and properties that developers can use to interface or customize upon. Now, controllers in model view controller takes the user input from the view and triggers actions based on behaviors, patterns, and properties set for the app in the model layer. Example functions include open camera, store data to database, retrieve data from database, or anything like this. Okay, we're almost come to the end now. We're almost in the end now. The layers that we just discussed is just the architecture for how Apple planned, layered, and designs their OSes. In practical sense, the OS files are distributed uh, across your computer. I would highly recommend you to read more from the Apple's documentation videos. Try making some basic apps with Xcode, or try using a Linux-based OS. Since it uses a very similar kernel and gives you more freedom to exploit and explore. Because Linux is an open source operating system, and you have all rights to meddle with it and even distribute copies if you're interested. With all of this said, I hope you guys found this video informative or inspiring. If you did, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and visit my website at harsha.in. With that said, guys, thank you guys for watching, and I shall see you guys in another video very soon.